Most build guides online focus on late game equipment and high character levels for establishing what you should do with them, assuming you're already extremely experienced at the game and have access to near unlimited assets. So today we're going to look at something more to help new players, or possibly returning players who haven't played in a while, by focusing on normal difficulty levels 1 through 40 and making the experience in normal as simple as possible. Today's starter build is, as you can tell, the Amazon, or more specifically, the Plague Amazon. As usual, let's knock out the stats first. The rule of just enough strength and dexterity for equipment and the rest in life also applies to this build in normal, especially since for the most part, you won't need to be able to block or hit, just aim. As recommended in most other starter build videos that I've done, veterans can usually just dump stats where they want and keep moving, but for new players, I'd recommend a more stepped approach based on what act you're in. In Act 1, we want to aim for 35 to 40 strength and dexterity by the end of the act, and the rest into vitality to ensure we have enough life for later and start building up stamina. In Act 2, we want to continue slowly building up strength and dexterity to about 50 strength and 45 dexterity and continue on vitality, and from Act 3 onward, it's just rounding out that strength to 60 or 70 and keeping in vitality until the end of normal, just to have a lot of life to kind of buffer things up. This is so you can equip most of the best gear you can find in normal, and also make sure you have enough dexterity for most javelins you'll find, or at the very least, be one level away from them, with 45 dexterity covering all the normal javelins except for throwing spears, which are the late ones in normal, and being one level away from the dexterity necessary for a maiden javelin, which is the class-specific javelin for the Amazon. The reason for this is just in case you find one of these with auto-replenish to save you on repair time and cost, at least a little bit, since they can't start dropping until late Act 1 onwards. The strength is mostly for kite shields in Act 2 at 47 strength, and some of the better set or unique items you can find for this build in normal. Next up are skills. The most obvious aspect of this build is going to be the Poison Javelin and Plague Javelin synergy, though there is going to be one big hurdle to this strategy, and that is Andariel, with her massive poison resist. Personally, I usually just muscle through it with jab, or grab a socketed dagger or spear, and throw some rubies or Ral runes in it to give me some fire damage, and then just chug potions and use antidotes for resists. That way, I waste as few points as possible and can keep dumping it into the Poison Javelins to get them as high as possible. As far as the core skills, you do want 1 point in at least the right 3 passive skills, Critical Strike, Penetrate, and Pierce, but 1 point in all passive skills can work out fine as well, getting you a Valkyrie by late normal. The rest of your points will be in Plague Javelin and Poison Javelin. The trick with these skills is you don't necessarily need to aim for your target, but rather aim to have your target move through the poison, or get a cloud around them at the very least. Equipment, as I said in the summary video a while back, is fairly simple for the Poison Javelin, and since we're focusing on consistency rather than luck, rune words and shopping are going to be your best friend. This means we want to go for the basic stealth armor using Tal and Eth in either studded leather armor or a breastplate, since they're light armor and won't slow your character down or impair our stamina. For jewelry, we want to be focusing on resist and mana per kill, maybe even a pinch of magic find if you can find them. Thankfully, you don't need an attack rating boost for the most part with this build, so it lets you have a little bit more freedom here. For boots and gloves, again, resists are a great go-to, as is shopping for chance to cast gear, especially Frost Nova whenever you get to Act 2 and have access to Elzix. He's a really good seller of these things. For belts, again, just like the others, resists, and you'll generally just want to focus on getting more slots as a new player though, so bigger belts are always going to be good until you can get to an exceptional or higher belt to rein in those strength requirements a little bit by using one of the smaller belts. The cap is a 4x4 belt. Helmet-wise, you've heard me say resist a lot, this is no exception, but if you aren't able to get mana per kill anywhere else, dropping a few tier runes in here can be a major boon, and it's probably the easiest slot to do this in, or if you get the runes for it, a lore made out of Ort and Soul is nice as well. If you don't mind playing in the dark, Nadir can be decent too, though generally I don't find the benefits to really be worth the vision hit and the gold income reduction, which is oddly enough unique to Nadir. Shield-wise, it's pretty much the same as most of the other starter builds. Get a light shield, like a kite shield with 3 sockets, and throw resist items into it. Since this kite shield can be shopped in Act 2, it's pretty easy to get. The reason we use kite shields instead of large shields is, like armor, there is a weight system here. With the large shield being medium weight, it will slow you down and increase the drain on your stamina, which is especially annoying in normal where you don't quite have as much stamina as you will later in the game. Now, you may have noticed we didn't talk about weapons or charms. That's because you're not going to fill up your inventory with charms in normal, so just use what you find. And as far as weapons, this build can literally work with the starter javelins, which are actually kind of nice thanks to the 1 gold repair cost on them, though you usually just add whatever spare javelins you find along the way for extra quantity. That said, there are some things that can make life easier, mainly Replenish Quantity being the major one, since it reduces the number of trips to town and the number of javelins you may or may not need to be toting around just to have the ammo. These can be found fairly early. I just have bad luck with it personally. As far as the dagger and spear mentioned earlier for anti-Andariel, this is just because these work best with the Amazon's breakpoints or skills, depending on which one you use, compared to the swinging weapons. On the mercenary front, the Act 1 mercenary can be fine, and somewhat handy against Andariel if you get a fire one just right off the bat, and they're kind of good because they run away from enemies, making it easier to get enemies to track through your poison trails, especially melee enemies. Act 3 cold mercenaries can be nice for kind of a similar reason, except they'll also freeze the targets, letting you get clusters of them with the clouds later on, and by the time you get to Act 3, you should have the AoE cloud poison skill, rather than having to treat poison trails like the Sorcerer's Firewall, like you have in your first 2 acts. If you need something a bit more tanky and you kind of don't really care about the trails because you're not quite used to the bob and weave and wanting to avoid actually getting hit, period, the Act 2 Combat Mercenary with Prayer is a nice beefy boy to handle a lot of threats, especially if you get him a good weapon and a little bit of leech. It is worth noting, yes, bosses will be a little bit slow for this build, but due to how tanky it is, the sheer massive damage, albeit over a fairly long span of time, there's very little that will survive the poisoning, especially as you gain levels, and as long as you're doing damage to the bosses, you're doing good. It is worth noting Act bosses will not heal ever, so you don't have to worry about that. This is actually one of the 2 common normal difficulty builds of the Jamazon. The other one is actually better at killing bosses, and it's actually better at transitioning into Nightmare and Hell without high-end equipment, but it does struggle a bit more with crowds. As with all these builds, this is designed to just be played through normal without wasting your initial respec, and then using the one in Nightmare. That way you can spare the normal one to play around with before you get Tokens of Absolution. I may do the Lightning Javazon tutorial for a low-level build as well, because it is really good for killing the bosses and skips over even using your Nightmare respec, but this one is generally going to be easier for new players to kind of get the grasp of.